Have you trained exclusively raw powerlifting, or have you tried gear powerlifting?
So um, I would say most of my, especially early competitive career, was in equipped powerlifting. So, that initial stage that we've been talking about obviously was raw. And that was the thing that I cared about the most. But sometime toward the end of my high school career, as I had begun learning more and more about powerlifting as a sport and learning about how it's done competitively, at the time there was no raw powerlifting, at least in any major sense of the word. If you wanted to compete, you competed equipped. And, um, I was reading about, bench shirts and squat suits and stuff like that. And there was a thing I wanted to mess with. It wasn't a thing that I cared about for its own sake. But I do remember getting my first bench shirt and my first squat suit when I was still in high school, and having nobody around to help me learn it or figure it out or anything. Um, Honestly, I ordered it and I got it, and I didn't even know how to put it on. I remember like just struggling to try to get this bench shirt on, and then not really going past my forearm, and thinking, uh, well, I'm not sure if this is right. I remember my dad saying, like, I think you got the wrong size. Like, well, no, it's supposed to be tight, and you just figured it out. As you went, you just figure stuff out, and so that was kind of my introduction to it. And then um, when I got into college, and that was when I would say my real competitive powerlifting career took off. Um, that was all equipped. And I didn't really get out of the equipment in any serious sense until probably 2010. So I would say from like 2002 to 2010, my focus was equipped powerlifting. But even then, I always cared about my raw lifts. And uh, again, I would talk to my dad about this, and he never really got it. Like it never, I shouldn't say never really got it. The equipped stuff didn't really matter to him, you know. Um, and I think in large part because of that, but also because of how everybody starts out in powerlifting, it didn't really matter that much to me either. The thing that mattered the most to me was how strong am I, and you can figure out how strong am I without the equipment, And one thing I always told him was that, I'm good at this and I want to compete internationally. And, you know, given the current circumstances, the only way to compete internationally was with equipped powerlifting, you know. And if they ever stood up a raw division that was, an international competition, then I would be all over it. And they did that. I believe it was in 2012 was the first Raw World Championship, and I went to that one. That was in Stockholm, Sweden. And yeah, as soon as they stood it up, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I've been pretty much raw ever since. I did do an equip cycle about a year ago. Figured, hey, I haven't had gear on in like 6 years, so um, let's try it and see how much I hate it. Was what I was telling people. And actually, it was pretty fun. It was a nice change, and the training was much different. It's a different feeling, really, and it was kind of a neat thing to go back to. I ended up not being able to do that competition. We had a family emergency, but if I got healthy enough to do it again, then yeah, I might give Equipped another try.
So what are some of the key differences in training and in competition when it comes to geared versus raw lifting?
Well, in training, it's well, I suppose it's similar in training and competition. I mean, there are some, I suppose obvious differences. Like the equipment changes things like your weaknesses. Um, Take a bench shirt for example. It makes it easier to push the weight off your chest, harder to lock out. That's why when equipped lifting was more popular, powerlifting training, especially bench training, had a really strong triceps focus. It's because you need that to be able to lock out a bench. So there are some things that are like that that are maybe even in the category of obvious, changes in weakness and things like that. Some things that are probably not so obvious. It's difficult to do as much volume in the equipment, especially if you wear the equipment with a reasonable degree of tightness, because you end up walking this really fine line between your ability to do the lift in a technically correct way and the amount of weight that you can lift in general. So a problem that you have with equipped lifting that you don't have with raw lifting, for example, is finding a weight that you can both touch your chest with and press to lockout, and the same with squatting to depth, and being able to stand up with. And that creates some interesting problems, right? So, for example, it's fairly common knowledge, I think now, that when you go to a competition, you want to open with around 90% of your goal weight, and different people have different schools of thought on that, but most of us end up in the ballpark of 90%. But with equipped lifting, that can sometimes be a difficult thing, right? Because depending on the shirt that you wear, you may not be able to touch 90%. And so it creates some interesting problems in terms of, well, maybe you have to open a bit heavier, 92, 93%, or maybe it's not a good idea for you to open in this shirt. Maybe you should open in a looser shirt and then change between attempts. And, so it leads to some different tactical considerations in terms of the actual competing. And you have similar concerns when you're training as well, So from a more practical standpoint, one significant change that I make when I'm training an equipped lifter is that we'll do equipped training once a week, and it has a heavy emphasis on singles because it allows us to use a heavy enough weight that they can practice in a technically proficient way without, the problem is if you go too light, then they're not touching their chest or they're not squatting to depth and things like that, right? So you've got to go towards singles in order to allow them to lift in a technically proficient way. But then how do you make up for the volume? Well, what I've done in the past is I'll have them do one rep set at the end that's, a set of 3 or a set of 5 or something like that. And we don't worry about touching or reaching depth or something like that for that set. It's just about finding a good rhythm, learning the groove of the equipment and getting some additional volume. But even then, the bulk of the volume comes from raw training. And part of that is because it's easier to get the volume that you need with raw training, but also part of it is, again, practical. The equipment, it shapes your skin, right? Everybody or most people who've looked into this to any degree have seen bruises and things like that come about from wearing a bench shirt or wearing a squat suit. So it's not a thing that you can tolerate doing, 3 times a week or even twice a week in a lot of cases. It just hurts too much, and it's extra wear and tear on your equipment too, which is a problem. So there are definitely some practical constraints that get levied on training, from the perspective of just dealing with the equipment.